right, everyone. So in the last video, I was kind of talking about, JavaScript and P5, and I'm probably going to come back to it from time to time, just as kind of hopefully a reference point. But let's talk about writing code in Unity and working with C Sharp. So I'm inside of the scripts panel here, and what I'm going to do is make a new script from scratch. I'm going to do that by right-clicking and going to create. And I'm going to click on the option that says mono behavior script. And when I do that, it's going to give me this. Now, this is going to be a script, and you can write whatever you want. Keep in mind, there's a couple of rules here. Whatever you call it, the script has to be capitalized. So I'm just going to call this, my first script. Okay. You don't technically have to capitalize the other letters, but like the first letter has to be a capital. Okay. And if you see down here, it says my first script .cs, and CS stands for C Sharp. Okay. C Sharp is the language that we are going to be using in this course. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up this script so we can take a look at it. It helps to have something like Visual Studio Code or some other sort of programming code editor, I should say, available. Like, if you don't want to use Visual Studio Code, you could use, Sublime Text or Atom or something like that. I like using Visual Studio Code, and to be honest, it's kind of the default of Unity, so I kind of recommend it if you don't have too much of a reason against it. So I'm going to double click, and that's going to open up Visual Studio Code. And I just want to kind of go through some of the stuff here, okay? So we kind of understand what's going on here. So this is my Unity script, okay? And you'll notice that it says public class. I don't want to really talk about a class right now unless you're familiar with what an object is. I did talk about classes with some of my students in 427, but I'm not sure if everyone covered what a class is in programming. But at least note that the name of your class, this is public class, has to match the name of the file. So see how it like matches the casing in terms of the capital M and the capital F and a capital S. So if you change the name of your class, for instance, or even the name of the script, let's say I renamed it Mr. Hurwitch first script as opposed to my first script, I would also actually have to change that here. Okay. What's going on here is this is the area that we're going to be doing our programming. Okay. And you might notice that it comes with these little two areas called void and start and update. And it's very similar, not to bring everything back to P5 per se, but if you remember back in P5, P5 had this structure that we could take advantage of. And we had this setup here. And the setup was a function that would run once as soon as the program ran. So what happens here is I have this function in P5 says create canvas, which builds a canvas or builds, what it really does is build an HTML canvas tag. And what this is saying is, okay, when someone launches the script, which is me hitting this play button, do everything inside of this once, okay? And just to show you that it only runs once, let's use a little print function. This is running. And if I run this script, it should do this once, and then it's going to do this once. Okay. Now, the setup only happens once, if you remember, right? And then what happens is, well, while the program is running, which it's doing right now, if I want to make any changes to things or evaluate it basically on every frame, that has to happen in the draw section. All right, so the draw section or the draw function is essentially a loop that just constantly runs this over and over and over again. I kind of like to think of it sort of like it's like an animated GIF. It just keeps going forever. It just never stops. Unless you specifically tell it to. So if I have my little dancing banana the dancing banana just runs forever unless you tell it to stop, okay? And that's kind of how this works. So what that means is that if I were to put the console message here into the draw and run this again, you can see this number, so it keeps growing. This is how many times this has been run. So essentially what happens is it did this, and then it reran it, and then did this again, and reran it, and did this again, and reran it, and reran it, and reran it, and reran it over and over and over again, okay? Now, what does that have to do with C# here? Well, Unity actually kind of has a built-in similar structure, except in this case, they don't call it setup and draw, they call it start and update, okay? If you're wondering what void means, void is something you add to a function that determines or states whether or not the function returns a value, like a number or a string or something. Void basically means this function's not required to return anything. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just in my little script I wrote, I'm going to use this function. Remember, a function does something, and it's called debug.log. Okay. And what that essentially means is it's like the print function in P5, where it's going to write something to our console. And I'm just going to say this is running. Okay. I'm going to save my code. And I'm going to go back to Unity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, I think this is scene 5. Okay. And I want to add this to my game. Now, I could technically apply it to anything, but I recommend that if you start adding scripts, it might help to have an empty or an object you can apply it to so you know where to look for them. So I'm just going to create an empty, and I'm going to call this code. Okay. And at the moment, my code really has nothing on it. But what I'm going to do is add the script that I just wrote. Okay. And let's try this out. I'm going to run this in game mode. And what should happen is in the console, it should say this is running, and it should do it once. Okay. And it did. Let's turn this off. Let's go back. I'm going to move this to update. Update is basically the same as draw in that it will update every single frame. A frame, if you don't know, is a fraction of a second. In Unity, there's about 30 frames per second. So in other words, this update function should run 30 times per second. Okay. So if I go back, let's let the code update. And I'm going to run this. And what should actually happen this time is rather than it running once, it's going to run multiple times. You can see that. See how this is like constantly rerunning it? Okay. This is basically the same thing. This is inside of the scripts. I have drill scripts. These are like the specifically coding scripts. And this is the same. I'm going to get rid of the script by basically removing that component. And just, I'm going to use the same thing here. And if you double click, this is kind of meant to be the same thing, where I can put debug log, debug.log, something, hello world. Second. And I'm going to add this to my code. Okay. Oops, I added it twice by accident. I'm just going to move one. And if I run this in the world or run this in the console, it should just say hello world once. And that's what it does. All right. Let's talk about variables. Okay. So a variable, let's go back to P5 for a second. So we talked about in the last video what a variable is. So I could make a variable, and a variable at the end of the day is just it's a container that holds a value. Okay, imagine it like an empty box, and it's like, this box can hold a number, or it can hold a sentence, or it can hold a logical idea like true or false. And normally we did it kind of like this, let, X equal, David Hurwitz or something, right? And the thing about variables in JavaScript is we don't really have to specify what type of variable it is. Like technically this is a string variable, but I could also make this a number variable, or I could make it a Boolean variable. The difference between, this is one of those just differences in languages. In C#, you actually have to state what type of variable it is, okay? So what I'm going to do is, before we run the start function, I want to define, or what we call declare a variable, okay? And I'm going to create what's called an integer, okay? An integer, or an int in C#, don't capitalize it like it's doing here, it's just lowercase. An integer is essentially a whole number. So like 4, 25, 5,002 or something, okay? So I'm going to say int, I don't know, I'm going to come up with a number, my fave number, and I'm going to set it equal to 25, okay? And then what I can do is, let's do that same debug log, and I'm doing this inside of the start function so that I can get access to it, or I can run this. And let's do a little variable substitution. Remember, variable substitution is once we declare a variable with a value, that value can be substituted anytime that variable is used. So if I say my fave number, so what should happen is when this runs, I've declared this variable, this integer variable, it's equal to 25. When this runs, this value should go into here, and that should be printed to my console. So let's try this out. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to remove the I'm going to remove this script. So, and I'm going to add the variable script, and I'm going to hit play, and let's turn on console, and it should do it. It should give me 25. It does. All right. The thing about declaring variables is I may want to be able to access that variable or that value in Unity itself without having to go back to the code here. Okay. Now to do that, what I could do is, before I declare what type of variable it is, I'm going to make this a public variable. When something is a public variable, that means it's open to Unity to see the value and see the name of the variable in the program itself, okay? So I've set this to public, and I'm going to go back to Unity, and you're going to see that, give it a second, you can see that my variable shows up right here, and I can actually take a look at the value. Not only that, I can actually reset the value. So rather than let's say in the code, I set this to 25, but let's set it to 50 here. And so what that's going to do is me setting it in the user interface is going to overwrite this. So when it comes to this part of the program, it's going to use 50, not 25. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to hit play. Okay. I want to make a string. Let's say I wanted a name. So I'll say, name, public string, which is, so a string is just like a string in, she would stop capitalizing everything on me, but a string is just like a string in JavaScript. It's a collection of letters, a number in characters. So it's like, a name like Joe, or, I don't know, tomato or something like that. So if I wanted to say public string name, I'm going to set this to Joe student. Okay. I'm declaring a variable called name. It is a string, which means it's meant to hold text or characters usually, and currently the value is this. Okay. If I were to come in and change that, let's go back to my code. Okay. You can see that name shows up, the value shows up. If I were to print or run this in my console, so it's Joe student. And just like the other one, I could change this. Let's make this Jane student. And you can see now that overrided the value there. We can, so an integer is a whole number. We also have something called a float. A float is a number that has a decimal place, like 3.14 or, 0.5 or something like that. The way you would do it, I'm going to say public float. I'm going to call it interest rate, just like we did in the other one. And let's set that to 1.5. Now, if you're going to use a float, meaning you have a decimal place, you have to put F at the end, F for float. That's just the way C# works. I'm going to hit save. And if I go back, it should allow that, and it does. Remember, we also talked about the concept of like a logical idea, like true or false. That would be, that's called a Boolean in general in computer science. Here we call that a bool. Okay, bool is short for Boolean. So Boolean would be true or false. It's the possible values you can have. So I'm going to say public bool. Let's say, once again, in my, let's say it's a game and I want to know, does the player have the key? Has key, and I'm going to say false, meaning they don't have it. Okay, let's hit save. And if I go back to Unity, you can see that this is a checkbox that can be turned on and off. Okay, so we can create variables that we can then call inside of our functions. Okay, so I might say something, I'm going to do something where it's like, okay, I have a number called my fave number. I'm going to do something where I say my fave number is equal to my fave number plus, I don't know, 10. Okay. And then I'm going to print that value to the console. So it's going to start at 25. Variable substitute this plus 10 equals 35. That's the new value. And then that value should be shown in the console. So I'm going to hit play. All right. So it's actually set to, it was set to 50, but if you do out the math, 50 plus 10 is 60, and that's what happened there. Okay. So that's that. This is the basics of writing C#. Hopefully you're noticing it's not dramatically different than, how we did stuff in P5. It's just the syntax is a little different. You have to declare whether, what type of variable it is. You didn't have to do that with JavaScript, but we're still like creating a container, giving it a name, giving it a value, using it for variable substitution. Okay. In the next video, I'm going to go over how to do things like if statements. And then we're actually going to talk about how to use certain properties and things from objects in Unity. Okay.